Tudo bem? Thank you.
Olá, boa tarde a todos, sejam todos bem-vindos a mais uma semana, mais uma edição do nosso ciclo internacional de seminários sobre literatura greco-latina, do Império Romano ao Renascimento, evento organizado conjuntamente pela Universidade de Buenos Aires e pela Universidade de São Paulo. É um evento que tem sido extremamente significativo, enriquecedor para nós da organização, e tenho certeza também que para todos os ouvintes, uma vez que temos estado, né, estamos trazendo para vocês autores e temas pouco debatidos, pouco valorizados em nossos currículos, né, em nossos cursos de literatura canônica. Então, estamos aí expandindo bastante horizontes dos estudantes, né, interessados em letras clássicas, além de, né, estarmos aí contribuindo para a construção de uma ponte, né, muito importante entre as nossas universidades, os nossos países, né, as nossas línguas e a literatura antiga estudada em nossos cursos, e esta mais, né, tardia, que tantas vezes aí deixamos passar, mas que é tão importante. Então, eu agradeço novamente, como todas as semanas, a oportunidade que me foi dada de participar da organização, né, desse evento, pela professora Liliana Pégulo, pela professora Cecília Ugarte Mendia. Agradeço hoje especialmente a nossa convidada, a professora Therese Fuhrer. I thank you, Therese. It's so nice to see you. Such a privilege, such an honor, and a pleasure to see you again. Thank you so much for being with us. Agradeço ao nosso audiovisual, né, ao Miraldo, que está aqui conosco hoje, que possibilita a transmissão do evento, né, pelo YouTube, para atingir a um público maior. Lembrando que todos os inscritos, todos aqueles que mandaram um e-mail, né, receberão certificado. Todos aqueles presentes podem, se quiserem, fazer comentários e perguntas ao vivo, né, de viva voz no final da conferência. E aqueles que estão assistindo pelo YouTube podem também mandar por escrito seus comentários, suas perguntas, que serão repassadas aqui à nossa convidada. Então, para não atrasar mais o nosso evento, passo a palavra à professora Liliana com um agradecimento especial a todos os presentes hoje. Obrigada.
Muchas gracias, Elaine. La verdad que es un honor tener a la doctora Fuhrer como invitada, sobre todo para trabajar un tema como es este de la decadencia, de la caída, y que constituye un mito recurrente, tal como se advierte a través de los textos que nos ha hecho llegar tan generosamente, a partir de los cuales va a desarrollar sin lugar a dudas su conferencia, ¿no es cierto? Con lo cual podemos ver a través de esos textos cómo este mito ha recorrido, ¿no es cierto?, la filosofía, la literatura, desde la antigüedad, y cómo se ha proyectado en la antigüedad tardía, renovándose y resignificándose. Por eso me parece verdaderamente necesaria esta charla, en la medida que se advierte esa continuidad, que no hay compartimentos estancos entre la literatura o la filosofía antigua y la literatura de época imperial y, podemos decir, tardo-antigua. Por lo tanto, es una oportunidad muy importante para este ciclo, para estas universidades, para nuestras facultades y, como dice Elaine, para nuestras lenguas, poder contar y ampliar nuestros horizontes. Así que muchas gracias. paso
Bueno,
la palabra a
sí.
Cecilia.
No hay problema, muchas gracias a todos los participantes, ¿no? Me hago eco de las palabras de la profesora Elaine y de la profesora Liliana Pego, la de Buenos Aires, obviamente, es un honor tenerlos todos aquí, y es un gran honor también recibir hoy a la profesora Therese Fuhrer de la Universidad de Múnich. Yo voy a leer rápidamente, para ya pasarle la palabra a ella, un brevísimo resumen de su vastísima carrera. La profesora Fuhrer es actualmente catedrática de la Universidad de Múnich, en el área de filología latina, y tiene una vasta formación en literatura antigua en general, griega, helenística, romana. Es autora de incontables publicaciones, y entre ellas una edición de Magistro de San Agustín, y se dedica especialmente a la literatura latina, tardoantigua, y actualmente ella se encuentra impresa un libro que trata justamente del tema que ella nos presentará hoy. El título del libro, que está en prensa y que será publicado a final de año, es Fallibility and Fallibilism in Ancient Philosophy and Literature. So do not wait any longer for the presentation. I am going to let Professor Fuhrer speak, and I just wanted to say thank you so much again for the public being here, and of course for Professor Fuhrer accepting our invitation today. It's a great honor for us. So thank you, and Professor Fuhrer, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Liliana, and thank you, Elaine. It's a great pleasure to see you and to be with you, even if we are very distant from each other, but it's an excellent opportunity. So I'm now going to start my PowerPoint presentation and hope it will work as it did a few minutes ago.
It's working.
It's working great. So I just start. Ever tried, ever failed? No matter. Try again, fail better. Beginning with Samuel Beckett's most famous and probably most misunderstood quote, usually shortened to fail better, I would like to briefly explain what the following is about. The quote is often used in motivational psychology in the private sector or in politics as a motto, almost as a mantra, to spur young trainees on to continuously better and, as a result of the experience of failure, innovative performance. Failure becomes an opportunity if the right lessons are learned. And failure can even become a goal if it results in, for instance, financial or political advantages. But back to Samuel Beckett's quote. In the above-mentioned form, fail better, it seems completely out of context. The story Worstward, from which the quote comes, is about failure per se, its inevitability or inescapability. The constant non-achievement of goals, the failure that necessarily occurs in human endeavor, the persistence in errors and misunderstandings, the inevitability of death. In the following, I will deal with this human failure per se without moral or motivational psychological functionalization, without the perspective of optimization, progress, and success. My focus is on the explanatory models that can be found in ancient biblical, Greek, and Latin literature. At the center of my explanations are texts in which the inevitability of human failure is depicted. The causal connections of failures are narrated, and thus etiologies of human fallibilities are constructed. In doing so, I will focus on those narratives that are relevant to ancient philosophy and theology, or philosophical and or theological anthropology. The questions that interest me, you find them on the handout on page 1, are narrative elements and motives that are used to justify human imperfection. or to explain them. Or second question, in how these primordial defects are made visible in the human being, what consequences they have in human life and action. Third question, it's about the interpretation and evaluation and also the modifications of those narratives. On page 1 of the handout, I also propose a typology of these narratives. First type, the motive of descending or decadent development, an initially golden age, a golden world, an ideal world in which people live carefree, transitions into a society or a culture that is understood as a low point. It's falling down to a low point. The extant tradition of these narratives begins with Hesiod, Theogony, and it goes on. You probably all know Ovid's succession of the ages from Golden Age to Iron Age in the Metamorphoses. Usually what is interesting for people is this low point, the Iron Age, not so much the Golden Age and what is in between. This is scheme where which you all know, which goes back to Hesiod. Type 2, the myth of type 2 establishes the fallibility of man, which is attributed to one or more errors in the process during or after the creation of man. The fallibility of man is thus, as it were, a primordial state. And, what is important for me in my talk is the figure of thought of the primordial sin. The myth of type 3 describes the causal chain of guilt and retribution that fatally determines the life and actions of a social group or a family, at least during a certain time. Driving forces are not only the feelings of revenge, but also demonic spirits of revenge, especially the Furies. The myth of the first type is often used in ancient philosophy to illustrate the fallibility of people in the present. Those narratives, most narratives concentrate on, as I said, the low point, the deficient state of the present, of the Iron Age in the myth. I will take an example from Roman literature, and that's on your handout on page 2. In De Ira, in book 2 of De Ira, on anger, Seneca discusses the question of whether we should feel anger at shameful deeds and at other people's wrongdoing. Seneca directs the reader's gaze to the Forum Romanum, to the Roman marketplace, and to illustrate the nequitia visible here, he quotes a passage from Ovid's Metamorphoses, the account of the Iron Age that interests most. In the face of the omnipresence and constancy of man's wickedness, even the wise man, the sapiens, would have to make anger a habitus. But he, of course, reacts differently because he recognizes that, I quote in the text in translation, wickedness has been so broadcast and gained such power in everyone's breast that innocence is not rare, it's non-existent. The wise man also knows that man is born imperfect. Hac conditione nati sumus. He knows the conditions of the conditio humanae vitae. The evils and disorders are in principle curable, but there remains the problem that very, very few turn out wise in the whole expanse of time. Paucissimos omni evo sapientis evadere. Even if the path to happiness is easy for a few, the fact remains that the entire human race, the genus humanum in the Iron Age, in the present time, is born with a disposition to fallibility, to peccare. I come to type 2, that's on page 3 of your handout. Chronologically, at the beginning of the history of mankind belongs the Prometheus myth. It's a creation myth, which is told twice in Hesiod's epics, each time to justify the hardships with which the human race has to struggle from the beginning. This creation myth has a long tradition in ancient literature. In Plato's Protagoras, that's page 3 on your handout, text 2, the eponymous speaker recounts the myth of the creation of human beings by the gods. I'll give a brief paraphrase pointing out the errors of planning built into the production of the species man, as well as the actions to overcome some bad decisions. First point, I introduced these numbers in the text. They are not by Plato, but by me. So number 1, or first step, after the creation of humans, the gods commissioned the brothers Epimetheus and Prometheus to endow humans with different skills, equipment. Dynames is the Greek word. The process of creating humans is thus not entirely under divine control. Control is relinquished to inferior gods, the Titans, Prometheus and Epimetheus. Anthropogony was not designed for perfection, or perfection was not the goal of the creator gods. Stage 2, Prometheus allows himself to be persuaded by Epimetheus to let him, Epimetheus, take over the task of distributing the skills of living beings. Prometheus does, and that's step 3, does not foresee his brother's misplanning. The result is that no dynames are left for humans. Epimetheus heedlessly squandered his stock of properties on the brutes, is the translation. Stage 4, Prometheus tries to make up for this double mistake by robbing wisdom in the arts, en technosophia, and fire from the gods. Quote, he stole from Hephaestus and Athena wisdom in the arts together with fire, giving humans the means to defend themselves against the dangers of nature and wild animals. Although Prometheus' robbery enables humans to make up for their weaknesses with technical arts, which they each master differently, the situation remains, though, precarious, because civic wisdom he, man, had not, since this was in the possession of Zeus. And so they still do wrong to one another. Step or stage 5, Zeus recognizes the problem that the people would still not be able to survive, and so he instructs Hermes to bring them respect and right, eidos and dike. The fact that Zeus allows human beings only to share, to partake, metechein is the Greek word, in justice and shame, in right and respect, or eidos and dike, and therefore statecraft, indicates that not only the technical but also these ethical and political qualities are unequally distributed. In Plato's dialogue, the sophist Protagoras and then Socrates make suggestions as to how this deficient condition can be corrected, or according to the myth, how the human species can be repaired. Neither of them, Protagoras or Socrates, is aiming for perfection. The completely blameless individual, in Greek it's pan amomos, anthropos, does not exist according to the myth. To sum up, the story recounted in the Promethean myth of creation of the human race is based on a series of wrong decisions. The development of human civilization and technology is linked to motives such as iniquity, deceit, theft, disobedience, the wrath of the gods, and punishments inflicted by the gods, and above all, misplanning. The Prometheus myth, however, does not offer a master narrative for explaining human fallibility, not least because it does not offer a master plan of the creation of man and the rationale for the evils in the world. The hamartiological master narrative of human fallibility in the sense of type 2 is rather provided by the creation myth of Genesis, the, I quote, most powerful myth of humankind. Thus the subtitle of the German translation of Stephen Greenblatt's Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve. See handout on page 6, Der mächtigste Mythos der Menschheit. The narrative is clearly structured. It's on your handout on page 4, limited to a few actors, one god, 2 humans, 1 animal, in 1 place, the Garden of Eden. The human sin is clearly grasped through the prohibition to eat from the tree of knowledge. The extent of the punishment is also clearly defined for each actor, namely mortality and the hardship of continued existence as promised in case of transgression. So it's much more clearly structured than the Prometheus myth. In Gnostic and other interpretations, the creator God attributed responsibility for the indebtedness, and so the creator God, is attributed responsibility for the indebtedness and subsequently the hardship and sorrow of human life. Similar to Plato's interpretation of the Prometheus myth, where also the gods are responsible for all the failure coming to the human life. In addressing the range of such positions, Jewish and early Christian exegesis offers the most popular interpretation. In the beginning, the good Almighty God gives the 2 original human beings the freedom to choose for themselves whether they want to eat from the tree of knowledge. God appears as the sovereign Lord over his creatures and over justice. He is the only and omnipotent creator. Man himself is held responsible for the transgression. I'm interested here in the doctrine of original sin anchored in the catechisms of the Christian churches, with which it is explained on the basis of the story of the fall that the whole of human history is marked by sorrow and suffering. One of the most prominent early Christian interpretations of the doctrine of original sin is Augustine's Confessions. The depiction of the protagonist, Augustine's own failure, illustrates the Christian anthropology, according to which he, as an Adamic human being, is repeatedly led astray from the commandment of moderation by a libidinous nature. In the narration of the famous conversion experience in the 8th book of the Confessions, that's text 4 on the handout, Augustine describes an almost Kafkaesque scene. He wants to withdraw from all obligation at the imperial court in Milan, also the chair of rhetorics. He wants to lead an ascetic life, and he wants to serve God alone. But he lacks the strength to want to take the last step. The spirit, his spirit, thus resists itself, for it is, as Augustine says, burdened with the monstrum of original sin, and therefore weakened. He uses the term 4 times even. Only through God's action and of grace can the will become relevant to action. While the pagan ethics proceeds from an optimistic view of man, as in principle in Stoic ethics, Augustine emphasizes the weakness and fallibility of human nature, which he explains with the concept of original sin, which denies man the possibility of ethical perfection by his own efforts and denies him perfection in this world. Fallibility belongs to man, even to the Bishop of Hippo. I come to my type number 3 of narratives of failure. The motif of hereditary sin is also present in the myth from which ancient Greek and Roman tragedy draws much of its material. The guilt of an individual becomes a curse on the family and thus drives its members to commit sacrilegious acts as fraud, murder, incest. They incur the wrath of the gods who persecute them in the form of the Furies, Erinyes, and provoke the revenge of their relatives. Here too, we have the figure of thought of the inherited urge to do evil, which is inscribed in a family, in a generation, through an initial guilt. Added to this is the question of justice, which is to be restored through retribution, revenge, or violent public punishment after an initial violation. And this has the consequence that new wrongs are committed that must be atoned for again and again. This is a sort of a vicious circle or vicious cycle. Using the example of the generational curse of the Tantalids, which can best be grasped through Aeschylus's Oresteia, let us briefly recapitulate how the scheme of crime, revenge, and atonement works. Tantalus, as you all know, has committed a sacrilegious crime, and he also the following 5 generations suffer the Tantalid curse. They deceive and are deceived. They murder and are murdered, in most cases by family members, so that their family history is characterized by infidelity, adultery, infanticide, incest, the killing of husbands or wives, and matricide. The driving forces behind this sequence are portrayed as the vengeful spirits of the Tantalid house. In Aeschylus's Eumenides, they are the Erinyes, i.e. avenging goddesses represented by the chorus of the tragedy, who appear at the behest of the ghost of Clytemnestra. That's text 5, the beginning. Clytemnestra, who has been murdered by her son Orestes, and who herself was punished for murdering her husband. The Erinyes are now called by her to avenge her son Orestes, his matricide. At Clytemnestra's instigation, They pursue him like a pack of dogs and they drive him mad. Only when Orestes flees to Athens is the superior goddess Athena, at the bottom of the page, able to stop the Furies from killing Orestes by means of a formal trial. They subsequently act as Eumenides, as benevolent and beneficent cult deities. The citizens of Athens must thereupon continue to respect and fear their agencies, albeit within a cultic and thus also political, legal, and social frame of rules. But the Eumenides, or the Furies, retain their terrible faces, their phobera, prosopa, it's right at the bottom of the page. And Orestes remains burdened with inherited guilt. For the female deities represent a fundamental human need for retribution, which can or may be incorporated into the legal system of a social group or polis, but not eliminated. Using the example from Seneca's Medea, now we come to text 6, handout page 6, where hereditary guilt and gender curse play no role. I would like to show how the figure of thought of the demonic forces can serve to illustrate and also explain the effect or the consequences of negative emotions. In Latin, it's affectus. It's a Stoic terminus technicus. Torn between motherly love and vengeful anger against the traitor Jason, Medea plans to kill her 2 children. Like Euripides, Seneca also has her articulate this conflict in a decision-making monologue, in which the mother's rational arguments and emotional scruples are countered not only by negative emotions such as anger, pain, and hatred, but also by the spirits of revenge. The Antiqua Erinnys seizes her hand against her will, repetit invitam manum, it's line 952, so that she unresistingly succumbs to her anger. 953, ira qua ducis sequor. She describes how the serpent whipping Furies and the spirit, the umbra, the ghost of her brother, demanding punishment for his murder, appear before her, and she agrees to be afflicted by the Furies and carries out the murder of the first child. When Jason then appears, she also wants to kill the second child. She overcomes a moment of hesitation with the argument that she has already committed murders, so that again, against her will, me invitam, 991, at the bottom of the page, a massive pleasure seizes her, 991, following voluptas magna min vitam subit et ecce crescit, to commit infanticide before Jason's eyes. The scandal of the double infanticide, the scandal of the double infanticide is thus seen not as a consequence of the rage, the ira, that the tragic heroine allows to arise from the first impulse, from the impetus, and incites herself further, as if to illustrate the Stoic theory of emotions. Incumbin iras penitusque veteres pector exim impetus violentus auri. Seneca here also invokes the old mythical explanatory model in which vengeful wrath is demonized in the form of the avenging goddess and a spirit of the dead, the Antiqua Erinus and the Umbra of her brother. With this narrative device, Seneca broadens the spectrum of possible interpretations of the irrational or at least non-rational force that makes a person want the evil against her or his or her will. The Stoic Seneca seems to attribute to the notion of the demonic an explanatory value that, almost like a Platonic myth, illuminates and externalizes, or at least supplements, the philosophical argumentation. The theatrical presentation of Medea's decision to commit a double murder makes the unconceivable, the infanticide, comprehensible, i.e., that the prima facie plausible desire for retaliation can escalate into a compulsive emotion to the point of frenzy. A person is driven by a demonic force in full consciousness. I come to the conclusion. Starting from the last type 3 of the last type 3 of failure narratives. The Furies can be understood as figurations or externalization of a historically and anthropologically founded mechanism that influences or even manipulates human behavior in such a way that perception and freedom of choice appear to be limited. The Furies persecute a wicked offender or persecute others on behalf of such an offender, and this results in a chain of actions and reactions that proves disastrous for everyone involved. A similar figure of thought is found in Augustine's Confessions with the description of the monstrum emanating from original sin that, as it were, truncates the will of the protagonist. The serpent in the Garden of Eden can be seen as the archetypal manipulative figure that persuades the first human beings to do what is forbidden. While the Furies are exemplars of personal, individual, or family revenge, Augustine's monstrum is a characteristic of the Adamic human and typifies him since the success of the serpent ever after. Common to them all is the figuration of a demon who persuades humans to think, to wish, and to act to their own detriment or to that of others, against the dictates of reason irrationally. The figures and their reactions presented in the myths illustrate the pressure on rational thinking that can dominate human thinking and action at certain moments. This pressure can be controlled by means of rules, laws, cultic respect, or fear of consequences, so that a community of human beings can coexist and make good life or successful life possible. But the question remains as to whether this situation of control can be established permanently. The Age of the World and the Prometheus myth narratives deal with diachronic development in a more comprehensive sense over and above personal, local, and temporal limits. Both present a sequence of events to explain human fallibility without a specific relation to a historical, individual, family, or polis city. Whereas the transgression of the divine command in the creation story of Genesis, regarded as the beginning of world history is perceived in prominent interpretive traditions as the aetion of all subsequent events until the second coming of the Savior or the last judgment. The three types of narratives analyzed in this paper all attempt by varying means to answer the question of why human beings, in principle or in certain instances, cannot think and act in a way that is free from error. I would now like to return to the current discussion of human fallibility to underline why I consider that the classical myths, not only because of their enduring power and prominence, have a high explanatory value for this basic anthropological problem. Like Beckett's wordplay on the F word, fail better, in his history Worstward, the classical myths also give a distinct profile to failure in narrative and dramatic terms, sometimes drastically, even with the portrayal of a murder. This profile is shaped and is thus plastic and vivid. In philosophical, theological, and anthropological discussions, the problem of fallibility is debated in abstract terms and is, so to say, divorced from the complexity of real life, whereas the myths, owing to their narrative and dramatic power, their excessive quality, and even their banalization, can be cognitively and at the same time aesthetically and sympathetically experienced over and over again. The variously medialized forms each propose a way in which the recipient can grapple with the problems presented in a specific and lifelike narrative space without theoretical abstraction. They do not serve as a starting point for the search for an ideal good life. In modern times, this would be a successful life and career, but as an anthropological diagnosis which states that unending failure is an indelible feature of human existence. Only in this sense can the myths also be interpreted as a discussion and evaluation of strategies for coping with irrational and unpredictable human behavior. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Therese. Thank you so much. What a gorgeous PowerPoint and marvelous speech. What a great speech you had. I have a lot to think myself because, as you know, I work with a 16th century radical reformer who thought a lot about human fall and associated it with evil. For him, the serpent in the Eden garden was evil itself. It was the devil itself sent to put mankind into destruction, etc. And by thinking so, he thought that the whole fall of creation, because for him it was it happened in a cosmic proportion. Even the stars fell with man because of man, and because man was responsible for that, man should fix it somehow. And then he proposed, he and the radical reformation, in maybe in general, proposed that men should fight sin, because it was man's work to restore the original pureness and the original condition of mankind, and even creation before the evil. So it's a very maybe idealistic reading of all of this, because it puts in men's hands the work of fight, the fall of the holy creation. And it says a lot about this movement I studied. Brought to me lots of elements to think and work, because it shows it's not a general Christian reading. It's not Augustinian, for example. It's radical. It's a heretic reading of the myth. So I will put a lot of thinking into this from now on, working into this. But if I can ask something after such a gorgeous speech, would be if the primitive Christianism associated already the fall with the human behavior. It's a primitive reading or a late understanding of the myth, the legend.
The interpretation which I put into my focus, the Augustinian one, I mean, he's not alone with this concept of the good God and good creation and the free will of the created man and woman, who are responsible themselves for their failure. This is obviously Jewish and Christian. And some say, especially in the case of Augustine, this is a counter-reaction against the Gnostic reading. The Gnostics say the Manichaean above all. Augustine himself was a Manichaean, so he knows this interpretation of Genesis, that this is a bad power. God is the principle of all bad powers, and made the world a bad thing, so that the human beings have to purge themselves. They have to try to get out of the darkness and come to light. And Augustine is saying, but he's not the only one. He picks up a tradition saying that this is a good creation. Everything that is made is good. And the man and also the angels, the fallen angels, so the serpent, which is often interpreted as the devil, Lucifer. So they all did it by their own will, and this free will is a gift of God. But there are also other interpretations. There are numerous interpretations. So specialists in Old Testament could give you a whole range of other explanations. But I think it's, I mean, contrary to the Prometheus myth, where you see the gods, they don't really care. And so there are many misplannings where the gods are responsible, and the human beings are not responsible. They did get their mistake or their deficits from the Titans and from the gods. And in this interpretation of Genesis, the responsibility is given to man. So it's a theodicy, whereas the other explanation would be an anthropodicy. So where the justice is, or the question of who has done wrong is put up to the gods. And in the other, in the Augustinian tradition of interpretation of the Genesis, the human beings are responsible themselves. So I would be interested in that radical reformation person. Sorry, I didn't get the name of this author.
It's Michael Servetus.
Ah, okay.
The author I study, but I think the Anabaptistas in general would say something similar. I've been in a defense some days ago about John Milton. And apparently, because of all the religious debates in the 17th century in England, The Devil by John Milton is very close. It's based on this radical interpretation, this devil who becomes a serpent that comes to makes a temptation, and through this temptation, the action of man is able to make all the creation fall because of man's sin, because of man's choice. I think it's even more heavy. It's heavier and harder than any other kind of guilty put on our back to carry, but it brings in the radical reformation, it brings to the responsibility of changing it. You have the free will to, inside the evil condition, choose the good and fight evil with your own life, because they look for martyrdom including. So it's all very heavy.
But as you said, also optimistic, because
because they really believe it in a full restoration of primitive church. This restoration, which they call restitutio, this restitution of the good primitive days of church, would be the way to prepare the second coming of Christ, but it would happen through a battle, and this good man who choose fight evil would fight in this battle against the devil, the dragon, etc. And of course, those men were the martyrs. So it's really an example of interpretation that made lots of men and women to lose their lives, and it's tragical in that sense. It's one of example of interpretation that really literally cost lives. And I think it's great what you do, and this book will be simply marvelous, because it's very important to know the archaeology of such concepts and the words, and to put this into perspective and understand things historically and in the context of each word, because we understand the fallibility of man, including to make choices with joining an interpretation and ideology. It's great. This book will be really fantastic.
Thank you.
Temos perguntas, comentários.
Yeah, we have a question from Professor Liliana Pegolo. She left the question on the chat.
Yo me avergüenzo de mi inglés oral, por eso pregunto de esta manera.
No hay problema. So Professor Liliana Pegolo is asking us to do this question. She left the question on the chat. I am going to translate it. Tell me, Liliana, if I translated with the sense that you wanted. So she's asking that, she's saying that since the centuries before the 4th and the 5th, before the 4th and the 5th centuries, the Gnostic way of thought was also turned out also very to be very important. So she wanted to know if you could say something about this, so about the importance of the Gnostic thought previously to the centuries 4 and 5.
Mm-hmm. As I said, Augustine himself was adhered to the sect, you could say, of the Manichaeans, and the Manichaeans are Gnostics. But this is just one way of thinking in Gnostic terms. There are other groups, but they are similar. That's why they are all called Gnostics. They think they can rationally explain why evil is in the world. They have many myths, and these myths are sometimes very, very adventurous, light and darkness, good and evil. So this dualistic sects or all Gnostic groups, very prominent, which you probably know. And as I said, the interpretation which is made prominent by Augustine, that there is a good almighty God, is understandable in part as a counter-reaction against the Gnostic interpretations of Genesis in particular. I mean, somehow we understand that we could say there is an evil power in the world. I think there are modern religions who still work with this idea. The devil is a very mighty power, and God is not almighty, but he tries to influence the humans to become good, but also the devil does it for his part. So we sort of can give the responsibility to these two powers, and can try, of course, to fight against the evil, but there is an evil power, and if something happens to our disadvantage, we can say it's the work of the evil power. So the Gnostics can explain everything by these two principles. And as Augustine says himself, he is using the Neoplatonic ontology, and he says there is no evil being. Evil doesn't have an existence. It's just a reduction of the good. And this is a very clever explanation for what is going on in Genesis and in the story of the fall. So the two human beings just turn away from to commandment and from the good creation. They are not becoming evil, but there is a reduction of goodness. So they have to suffer for this, for turning away from the good. And the serpent is a creation of God, and it represents the fallen angel Lucifer. So the idea of fallen angels is very a very good mode. I mean, in the creation myth, there are nothing is said about the creation of angels. So nothing is said about the fallen angels, only about the fallen human beings. And this enables Augustine against the Gnostics to say there is no evil power. There is even no evil being. God didn't create anything that was evil. He just gave the free will the possibility to turn away from the good. And I think this is that the Gnostics are very important to understand why this is so consequently, the Genesis is so consequently interpreted to avoid the existence of evil.
Thank you very much, Professor Fuhrer. Liliana, ¿tenés algo para agregar?
La importancia de esa oposición entre la luz y la sombra, ¿no? Que se comienza a profundizar. Recuerdo entre las cosas escritas por Aetiologically, por ejemplo, que habla de esta prominente oposición, que después se verá aún en autores cristianos, y que se advierte como un remedio gnóstico, ¿no? Perdón.
Que se advierte como un, perdón, que no
Un recuerdo de esta presencia gnóstica, esta evocación del gnosticismo que plantea esta dualidad entre la luz y la oscuridad, ¿no?
Professor Fuhrer, she just added that I'm sorry. She just added that how prominent is the opposition between shadow and light. That it remembers, yeah, that is remembered with this with this Gnostic thought. Yeah, so how important is this opposition between shadow and light? Es con este pensamiento gnóstico, ¿no, Liliana? Yeah. How much one can remember about this opposition when we think since the Gnostic thought?
Maybe I go back to the early dialogues by Augustine when he was in Milan on this chair of rhetoric, and influenced by, or there he learned about Platonic interpretation of, or Platonic ontology. And in these early dialogues, he's still very close to his Manichaean phase. So he takes up these Manichaean or Gnostic images or symbols, and there he says darkness doesn't exist. It's just absence of light. So this is also can be understood as a counterposition against Gnostic dualism. So there is no darkness as there is no evil, but he uses the same metaphors just to turn them around, to interpret them platonically. And when he explains the creation, the Genesis, the series of created things in the world, he also says God didn't create darkness. There were just the abyss was a place where there was no light, but there is not darkness. It's just absence of light. And he also says that because the creation of angels is not mentioned, light is at the same, when God creates fiat lux, when he says fiat lux, when light is created, he also created the angels at the same time. So light is the good, but since there is no bad, there is also no darkness. So I think the Gnostic elements are very, very important to understand what Augustine is doing.
Muchas gracias.
Thank
Es
you.
para pensar. Es para pensar mucho.
Thank you. Nós temos ainda alguns minutinhos, se alguém mais quiser fazer alguma pergunta ou comentário. Tenemos todavía unos minutitos, si a alguien le gustaría agregar algo más. Well, I don't think that we have any other comments or questions. So I think we can wrap up this last session that we have on the seminar. And it was a wonderful, wonderful class that you gave us, Professor Fuhrer. So we just have to thank you so much for being here, for letting us know, be part of your research too, and to have the possibility to know your research also in Latin America. And this important event that we are organizing tries to bring together these two universities, big universities in the South. And we have, like Elaine just said at the beginning, people that are actually very interested on the subject. So thank you for sharing this with us. And from my part, I just have to say that I'm very glad to have had the opportunity to hear this presentation. So thank you again, and it's been an honor.
Thank you. And it's a great idea to make this junction between the two universities, and I wish you good luck with the sequel of it in your next semester. And I would be very happy to meet you someday, and I'm sure I will meet Cecilia here in Munich.
Hopefully.
And whoever would like to come is welcome in Munich. So thank you very much for letting me see you and talk to you. And thank you for your attention and for your questions.
Thank you, Therese, for your generosity, your presence, your great speech, and looking forward to seeing you one day. I hope soon.
Yeah.
And obrigada a todos, muito obrigada. Aguardamos a todos no nosso próximo encontro, então, e boa tarde, obrigada. Tchau.
So, bye bye.
Tchau.
Só mais uma coisinha. Só lembrar todo mundo que semana que vem nós temos o encontro com o Tadeu Andrade. Que será também muito importante, o Dr. Tadeu Andrade, que agora ele está fazendo pós-graduação não, desculpa, pós-doutorado, né? Na Universidade de Buenos Aires. Pós-doutorado. O professor Tadeu Andrade, ele trabalha na Universidade Federal da Bahia, atualmente ele está fazendo pós-doutorado na Universidade de Buenos Aires, né? Portanto, ele também veio aqui juntar Brasil e Argentina para nós, e ele vai falar sobre Tifon, a recepção de Hesíodo em Nono de Panópolis. Então, tá, por favor, todo mundo convidado, continua acompanhando nosso ciclo, e é isso, até a próxima. Thank you so much again, Professor Fuhrer. Bis bald.
Bye bye.
Danke, tschüss.